Start. Start, Carl.
Hello, comrades. This is Carl Wood with the National Economics Commission of the CPUSA. Tonight or this afternoon, depending on where you are, we're presenting on political economy of modern capitalism. And I'm going to just say a few words of background before launching into the formal presentation. Most of us know Karl Marx as a scholar and a political leader in a lot of different dimensions. He was trained as a philosopher, a student of philosophy at least, but in fact he spent a great deal of his life digging into economics, the economics of capitalism in particular. And I think everybody knows that his magnum opus, is really the central work of his intellectual career, was Capital, volumes 1, 2, and 3, which form the basis of our understanding as communists, as Marxists, of how political economy works, of how the economy of capitalism, as well as other economic systems, work. And we're going to be digging into the mechanics of modern capitalism today, this afternoon, this evening. And in just a moment, I'm going to start up with the slide presentation. I'm going to wait about a minute for anybody else to come on to the session. My clock shows that it's 2 minutes past the half hour. And so I'll wait a little less than a minute and then we'll start.
Carl?
Yes.
There's noise. It's like coming from your end. Okay, it just stopped.
Okay.
But it'll destroy, that noise will destroy it'll make the recording less valuable.
Yeah, I don't know what it could be. I don't hear any noise.
Okay, it stopped. Okay,
real good. Well, then let's take advantage of the hiatus and the noise and let's move through. The name of this class is The Political Economy of Modern Capitalism. Just tell you a word or two about my background. I'm an old guy. I'm 74 years old, and I've spent most of my working life as an industrial worker and as a union. I've been a union member practically all of my working life, and I've worked in the steel industry, the utility industry, and been both a rank and file union activist as well as a local and national leader of a union. So I approach some of these things, or all of these things, I think, from the practical point of view of how does it affect working people. And that's informed not only by my study of the Marxist classics and other works, but also my own personal experience on the job in the industries where I've worked. So let's move on. First of all, what is capitalism? Capitalism is a historically evolved stage of human society. I think most of us are familiar with the commonplace knowledge about human society having evolved and developed through various stages, from very early humanity, which lived in a tribal situation, not a class society, through stages of slavery, of feudalism, and capitalism. Capitalism is characterized by, first of all, a concentration of wealth in the hands of a few people who own the means of production. The great majority of the population has no means of getting their living except by selling their power to work for wages. Marx called this class of propertyless workers the proletariat. Today we call it the working class. Virtually all production under capitalism is for exchange. That means things are produced for sale on the market, not for the personal use or the family use of the producers. And goods produced for exchange are called commodities. This is a key term that we're going to get into. It's one of the underpinnings of understanding capitalist economics. So what is a commodity? Marx wrote that the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as, quote, immense accumulation of commodities, end quote, its unit being a single commodity. So really, in order to understand capitalism, for starters, we have to understand what a commodity is. And Marx helped us with that by identifying three qualities that every commodity has. First of all, it's useful. It has what he called a use value. That is, it must satisfy some human want. Second, it's a product of human labor. So that, for example, a diamond that's buried deep in the earth is not a commodity until it's worked on by human labor. In other words, until somebody digs it out. Third, it's produced for exchange. That is, if something is just produced for domestic use by the worker or the worker's family, that doesn't make it a commodity. So, for example, a peasant farmer who raises crops and uses those crops to feed their family is not producing commodities. They only become commodities if they are produced for the purpose of bringing them to market and selling them for exchange. Ultimately, the exchange value, Marx simply called this value, of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time required for its production. That's an important term, socially necessary labor time. What that refers to, I think we all know that different workers have different levels of efficiency and diligence. Not everybody works at the same speed. Not everybody works with the same skill and effectiveness. I'm personally an electrician, a maintenance electrician, and frankly, I'm not the fastest guy on the team. But there are other people who are slower than I am, and there are some who are faster than I am. So when we talk about the socially necessary labor time, we're talking about the average time that's required for the production of a commodity. Long before the emergence of modern capitalism, merchant capitalists, if you want to think about who they might be, I think everybody has heard of Marco Polo, who was an Italian merchant who traveled to China and bought products there, spices and textiles and so forth, and brought them back to Italy and other parts of Europe, and then sold them for more money than he had bought them for. So he wasn't involved in the production process. He made his profits by buying and selling commodities, often transporting them from areas of abundance. Silk goods, for example, were relatively abundant where they were produced in China, to areas of scarcity, like Italy, where they didn't have silkworms, where they didn't have the wherewithal to make silk fabrics. And that's how the Marco Polos of the world made their profits. Some of the merchant capitalists were on the side, they were pirates. So they made some of the profits just by stealing from other people. And that tradition continues in modern capitalism. But under modern capitalism, new value is created in the process of production, not through exchange, not by buying low and selling high, but rather by producing new goods and services from commodities that are purchased for the purpose of production. Marx described the production cycle under capitalism by this formula that's showing on the screen. The capitalist starts with money. That's the first M in the line. With that money, the capitalist buys commodities necessary for production. Those commodities might include raw materials, equipment, machinery, land, buildings, and those commodities are called constant capital, because by themselves they can't create a new commodity with a value greater than their own value. For example, take the steel industry, which I'm fairly familiar with. If a capitalist starts out with a pile of iron ore and a pile of coal and some limestone and the machinery that's needed and so forth, all of those things are necessary for production, but they're not sufficient, because if without a special ingredient, they'll just sit there and will not result in any greater value. In fact, over time, they'll lose value because the machinery will rust, the other materials may wash away in the rains. But the crucial extra commodity is called labor power, or variable capital, which we represent by a small v. And so when we combine all these into this process, we start with money, we buy the commodities, both the constant capital commodities and the variable capital, that is the wages to pay the workers. It goes into a production process. And out of that production process, we come out with a new commodity or set of commodities. And so all those raw materials I was describing go into a steel mill. The steel mill produces steel, sheet metal or rods or bars or whatever form the steel takes. And that is then sold for money, which, if the whole process works out right for the capitalist, is a greater sum of money, frequently a considerably greater sum of money than what the capitalist started with. The employer hires workers, and that's another way of saying, or we have another way of saying it, the employer buys labor power. Doesn't buy the labor itself. The employer could hire me and just have me sit around until I'm needed, and the employer is not buying my labor because I'm not performing any labor, but it's buying my time and my availability to do labor when directed by the employer. And that's why we make a distinction between labor and labor power. But the employer hires workers, buys labor power, and the labor that they add to the production process is what creates new value. However, the pay that workers receive for their labor power is only a fraction of the new value created by their labor. The rest of the newly created value goes to a number of different categories. We all know about owners' profits, and that's really as far as a lot of people understand about how capitalism works, is that the owner makes an investment and buys the materials and the labor power and then makes a profit. And we all know about that part of it. But other parts of this additional labor, additional value that's created, go into other categories. For example, commercial costs such as advertising, sales commissions, political lobbying, all of those necessary for this process of capitalist production, because the stuff has to be sold in order for the capitalist to make a profit. And all of these are necessary components of going from raw materials and through production to finally the sale of the end product. Some of the excess value goes to excessive compensation to top management. In recent years, in recent decades actually, the level of excessive compensation to top management, in other words, CEO salaries, has become scandalous. And I think anybody who picks up a newspaper sees the headlines about the compensation that top officers of corporations get. And while it's not a new development that top management gets paid very well, what is a new development is when we see CEOs of companies making many millions of dollars per year as compensation, something that couldn't possibly reflect any real contribution that they make to the production process. Part of the surplus value also goes to pay interest on bonds, on bank loans, any way that the company that is engaged in the production borrows money in order to use it for financing the production process. And then there are other categories that sort of generically we refer to as rents, but they include rent itself. If buildings and land are rented by the capitalist in order to facilitate production, but also licenses and patent fees. All of these in themselves do not contribute to the production process, but they result in somebody making money, and that money comes out of the total surplus value. So together, all of these are called surplus value, which we represent by the letter small s. In most U.S. industries, total surplus value is at least 3 or 4 times total wages. In other words, even though labor produces all value, workers only receive 25% or less of what they produce. So why do businesses claim that their rates of profit are so much lower than 75 or 80%? Every time there's a grocery strike or the threat of a grocery strike, the grocers claim that their profit rate is only 2%. And I'm not going to go into how they arrive at that. But there are 2 reasons that, in general, why these numbers don't correspond. First, they only include part of the surplus value. That is the owners or the shareholders' profits in the equation. The boss cries poverty when they get into wage negotiations because the shareholders are only receiving, say, 10% rate of profits. But actually, the banks, the landlords, the bondholders, the corporate officers, they're also getting rich from the value added by the workers' labor. In contrast, Marxists use the following formula to describe the rate of profit. That is, the rate of profit equals the surplus value divided by the variable value. In other words, the total excess over the cost of production divided by the amount that goes to wages and worker compensation, and then turn that into a percentage. And what you come up with is something called the rate of surplus value. And that's much more useful for actually understanding the dynamics of capitalism, because we're looking not at the rate of profit, which of course is of concern to the capitalists, but the rate of surplus value, which can also be called the rate of exploitation. The rate of exploitation, or the rate of surplus value, is the surplus value. That is the extra value that is added through the production process, divided by the portion that goes to the workers, or the variable capital, turned into a percentage. And so in Marxist terms, exploitation is not just a quality or a form of oppression, but it's also quantitative. It can be measured. I'm sure that we've heard people say, I only make $13 an hour and I'm exploited, but you make $27 an hour, so you're not exploited. That's perhaps a qualitative view of exploitation, but it doesn't reflect the Marxist analysis. The Marxist analysis is that if you get paid less than what you produce, then you're being exploited. And this formula also expresses the degree of exploitation under capitalism. Now, bourgeois economists never use the rate of surplus value formulation, but as a practical matter, capitalists perfectly well understand its importance. In his book, Super Profits and Crises, the late communist economist Victor Perlo quoted ads by state governments in business journals that weren't read by too many workers. I've included a couple of these quotes here. One, this is out of an ad placed by the state of New Jersey in a business journal. And they said, profit from the highest workers' productivity of any industrialized state in America. value added per dollar of wages is a hefty $3.76. That's $3.76 per dollar of wages versus the national average of $3.36. That's the only measure of labor cost that matters. What really matters is how much value was added to your raw materials or component parts by those workers during the manufacturing process. That's an awfully Marxist statement to be coming from the state of New Jersey, but there it is, and it was published. This was published sometime back in the 1970s. Actually, the numbers have changed since that time, and they've changed in the direction that moves against the interest of workers, not the other way. Around the same time, not to be outdone, New York placed an ad saying that New York's manufacturing workers produce $4.25 in value added for every dollar of wages. So there you have it, coming from the official representatives of the ruling class, acknowledging that capitalists get $3 or $4 for every profits and related excess amounts for every dollar that the workers end up with. And that's what we understand as exploitation. In his book, The Unstable Economy from 1973, the same economist, Victor Perlo, calculated the rate of exploitation in the US in the post-World War II period using official US government statistics. I just picked a couple of lines. He has a year-by-year accounting in the graph in the book, but I didn't have room on the slide. It wouldn't have been readable. So what we can look at here, though, is starting right after World War II, 1946, the rate of exploitation, and all these are adjusted for inflation, was a little over 75%. The next couple of years later, 5 years later, it was up to 89.5%. And you can see from the chart, it kept going up and up and up. By 1969, it was 129%. I used Perlo's methodology that he described in the book and some US government statistics that I found online, and calculated that recent levels of exploitation exceed 240%. I'm not going to go into the reasons that the 240% doesn't correspond exactly with the 350% or the 400% that we were looking at in the previous slides. There can be some difference in methodology, and frankly, I'm not a professional economist and didn't have the wherewithal to break it down. But I think even 240% rate of exploitation is, I think, to all of us, it's outrageous, because what it represents is the robbery from the working class of the fruits of their labor. With that, I'm going to ask people to offer any questions and comments that you might have up until now. I've gone through this a little faster than I anticipated, so maybe I can spend a little bit more time responding to questions and comments. And so I'll ask Dee if she will open up for receiving some of those.
Okay, the floor is now open for comments and questions. If you'd like to introduce a comment or ask a question, please click the picture of the hand. Click the picture of the hand on your control panel, and we will know you want to speak. You can also open your mic, click the picture of the mic, so that when we open your mic on this end, you're ready. Okay, Cindy, your mic is open. Open your mic on your end. Cindy Farquhar, there you are.
Hi, Carl, thank you very much for this such a clear lecture, but my question is, so somebody has to pay for these rents, these licenses, these bonds, these whatever. So I'm just like pushing back. How do you call it surplus value when it has to be paid for in order for the commodity to get to market? Thanks.
Okay. I'm going to try to take all the questions first, and then I'll go through because there may be duplication, and maybe I can put them in some kind of logical order.
Okay, looking for more raised hands to indicate you want to introduce a question or comment. Matthew, your mic is open.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Matthew. He, him. Thank you so much again, Carl, for the presentation. I just had a question about the MCP formula, or MCM, based on the transliterations of it. What in a potential socialist or communist organized economy, what would this formula look like then? In that case, would it still be very similar except state-run, or would there be a different way to like invest in the economy, invest in how jobs are organized in the first place? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, looking for raised hands. Molly, your mic is open. Open your mic on your end. Molly, there you are.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Wood, for this excellent breakdown. And I did want to echo the first question that did come to mind too. Maybe an answer to that is that, like, who decides that these licenses cost money and these patents cost money? The capitalists. So it's just another form of expropriating, wealth that's not theirs. But my question was about, like, how do you respond to somebody who says, but like the capitalists are so brilliant and oh my God, like we can't, have anything happen without them telling us, how brilliant they are. And we need them to be, it's just like when I think about the CEO of Amazon, he went to all this education and all this stuff. So that's one of the things that they like to portray themselves as being worth this type of money. Thanks.
Okay.
A few more. Michael Madden, you're raising your hand and then you're putting your hand down. So you're confusing me. Giles, your mic is open.
Did you call me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay, so it seems like in order to try to know what the real value of our work and labor is, you're going to have to first find out about company finances. And in these days, they tend to keep that secret and hidden away from workers. Is there a way we could know about company finances without getting in trouble?
Thank you. Is that enough for now, Carl?
I think so.
Okay.
Let me just finish writing down Michael's question.
You mean Giles?
Are those Giles? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. I think I can take these questions in order. First of all, Cindy's question. Doesn't somebody have to pay for rent and all these other outlays that are not labor expenses? And certainly they have to be, that has to come from somewhere. The question is, first of all, are capitalists the only one that can provide that? And as we know from the experience in socialist countries, they're not. And the society as a whole, organized in the preliminary stages of socialism, can can provide the financing for various industries. And there are different approaches to that. One approach was used in the Soviet Union. In other socialist countries, there have been kind of mixed approaches which mix both public and private financing during the initial stages of socialism. But I think the key thing is what happens to the surplus value, the amount of value that's created beyond what the workers are paid. Because unlike anarchists, for example, or anarcho-syndicalists, Marxists do not believe that 100% of what is produced automatically goes back to the workers at that particular enterprise. There are a lot of reasons for that. One of them being that certain industries would then result in enormous amounts going to the workers, and others would result in very tiny amounts going to the workers. And there has to be some sort of leveling process in which the fruits of labor are distributed in an equitable manner throughout the working class. And there are other reasons as well that it's not really the time to go into that right now. But the key thing is that if these investments are made by society as a whole, in other words, if they're made by the state acting on behalf of the working class, then the surplus value that is created goes back to society as a whole, not to a small fraction of society represented by the moneyed class or by the capitalist class. And I think that's the key thing here. Sure, there has to be investment in order to make production happen, and that's true in every society. But it's a question of what happens to the produce of the products of that production. With regard to Matthew's question, the cycle of production formula, let's go back to that. And okay, what would that look like under socialism? Well, in a lot of respects, it would be fairly similar. You have to start with some capital, or the materials and the constant capital that's necessary for production. And you have to start with workers, and the workers have to be paid wages. And production takes place, and there would be new commodities that are produced. In terms of what the commodities are sold for, they obviously have greater value than the commodities that were started with, because the labor has added its magic to the process. And so there is greater value than was started with. And the difference really comes down to what happens with the new value that's created. And I just tried to describe that in response to Cindy's question. Some of it will go back to society as a whole. A lot of it will, to pay for all sorts of things that are needed by society. One is just the continuation of the production process. Another is the expansion of the machinery and the other components of constant capital, in order to facilitate greater production going forward, if that's what society desires. And it may also include increasing social benefits, universal high-quality medical care, for example. And I won't, universal free education at all levels, from preschool through graduate school and beyond. And these can all be financed by society as a whole in its role as the operator of the economy as a whole. Under capitalism, financing these socially necessary things is pretty problematic. and it's, as we all know, it's incredibly inequitable, and it's very inefficient. Lots of people don't get educated. Lots of people don't get decent health care. But the production formula itself, I think, remains pretty similar. Let's see, Molly asked, who decides what rents and so forth? Let's see, I didn't write down the question very well, but part of the question was, what do capitalists do to justify their earnings? Well, I guess the question is what they do and what they say. They claim, somebody like Elon Musk, for example, claims ownership of the concept of electric vehicles. That's ludicrous. That's absurd. His contribution to the process was organizing the production, and he's not the first person in the world to do something like that. You know, Henry Ford is widely given credit for the development and invention of the production assembly line for automobiles, and that certainly was helpful and was quite a contribution. And arguably, the inventor of that process deserves some kind of compensation. Whether that compensation, whether a realistic compensation, equitable compensation for that is to make somebody a multi-billionaire, or nowadays, you know, who knows what the limit on those billions of dollars is, I think is kind of absurd. The reason that these people get these enormous amounts of money from what they do is because they are sitting on a monopoly over some industrial process, and as a result, they are able to extract extreme profits from the labor of other people. And I think another thing to keep in mind here is it's kind of axiomatic, and Lenin asserted it, that capitalism does play an important role in developing the material preconditions necessary for socialism. Modern industry, frankly, is organized, except for in terms of who gets the dividends, but it's otherwise organized in a manner that will be used by the socialist society that succeeds capitalism. And Lenin said that imperialism, modern capitalism, creates the material preconditions for socialism. And that's certainly true. You couldn't have socialism, not modern socialism, without assembly lines. I think that Amazon, for all of its sins and shortcomings, made a great contribution in developing the distribution technology that will be used under socialism. And that, however, does not merit allowing someone to seize billions and billions and billions of dollars, making themselves the richest person or the second richest person in the world off the labor of other people, because it's the workers in those Amazon warehouses, it's the delivery truck drivers, it's the other people that work there who are actually creating the value. The value is not entirely created by the development of the process. The development of the process is part of it, but it's certainly not the bulk of the labor that goes into the process. It's one small portion of it. And so maybe Jeff Bezos deserves a pretty decent salary, more than a truck driver gets. Not 1 million times more or 100 million times more. Anyway, that's how I'd respond to that. And then Giles asked, how do you know about company finances? I don't have a snappy answer to that. With publicly held corporations, things that are listed on the stock market, for example, There are lots of legal requirements that they disclose a lot of their internal workings and internal finances, although not all of it. And they are constantly trying to cover up what they're doing, and among other things, to evade taxes, but also to prevent the public from understanding what's going on. And I think that short of moving to socialism, there are things that could be done through legislation to force the complete disclosure of the internal business workings of private enterprises. I don't expect that to happen under the current administration or the next one, but I think it's possible to move in that direction with mass pressure. And one example of this, I come out of the utility industry as well as the steel industry, and actually served a term as a state public utilities commissioner. And the state public service commissions and public utilities commissions were created beginning back in the 1880s as a result of a mass movement to force the railroads to disclose the workings of their finances, because they were squeezing the farmers out of almost all of their profit because of the monopoly that they held on the means of transporting farm goods to market. And so these commissions in almost every state were set up in order to force the railroad monopolies to disclose what their actual costs were. And certainly something like that could be done. That doesn't bring us socialism, just as we don't have socialism in the utility industry today. But we do have a greater level of transparency with publicly regulated utilities than we have for other privately owned enterprises. So with that, let's move on to the rest of the slide presentation. And I'll proceed from there. There will be another opportunity for questions and answers at the end. And so if you have any that occurred to you while we were having this discussion, please write them down right now, and then we'll take those in when we get on to the next portion. Okay. What we're going into now is not just the mechanism of basic capitalism, which and those mechanisms in a lot of respects haven't changed a whole lot since Marx's time. But we're going to go into some characteristics of capitalism, which have gotten a lot more attention in the 20th and 21st century. Although some of these certainly were present during Marx's time and were addressed by him to some degree. First of all is the concept of extra profits, and we're going to go into what we mean by that. Sometimes we say super profits instead of extra profits. But as we all know, I think, racism has been associated with capitalism since its beginnings, especially in the United States. The United States, in a lot of respects, it was, of course, built on the expropriation of the territory itself from the indigenous peoples that lived here, the Native American Indians, who were subjected not only to the expropriation of their lands, but also to forms of genocide, being wiped out entire populations in many cases. But in addition to that, with the development, development of European domination of the New World after Columbus, very quickly on the heels of that began the slave trade from Africa, and a large portion of the population of the continent of Africa was virtually exterminated in the course of capturing people, training people to be slaves in the New World. They were kidnapped, they were transported to the coasts, and transported under unspeakably, almost unimaginably horrible conditions to the New World, and where they were forced to work on plantations and engage in production. And this was coincided with the very beginnings of modern capitalism. And so the forms that slavery took, slavery wasn't new. Slavery has existed in other forms of society for millennia. But it took on a particularly brutal and systematic form under capitalism. In addition, sexism, as we know, has been deeply embedded in every class-based human society, including capitalism. And under capitalism, super exploitation, that is the extra profits from discrimination against racially oppressed groups, against immigrants and women, means that these workers are paid less than the value of their labor power, to say nothing of the value they produce by their labor. And what we mean by the value of their labor power, the value of their labor power is what it costs to produce that labor power. In other words, what it costs to feed, clothe, house the worker and allow them to reproduce the working class. So that is to support their families. And people, groups of people who are subjected to this extra profiteering are not even receiving the bare value, the bare minimum value of their labor power. That is the minimum that's needed in order to reproduce that labor power. Some people think that groups of workers that are not racially or sex or oppressed for racial or immigration status or gender, that these are paid more than what they're worth. In fact, what's happening is that other groups of people are paid less than what the value of their labor power. According again to Victor Perlo, domestic super profits, that means these extra profits that result from wage and income differentials due to racism, totaled $150 billion in 1984. I don't have recent figures, although there are economists who have calculated these things. I just don't have the numbers close at hand. But it's today many, many times more than $150 billion that was the case in 1984. Combined with the super exploitation of workers in other countries, because workers outside of the United States, in what we sometimes call third world countries, but less developed countries, particularly in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa. The profits, those workers are pretty consistently paid less than the actual value of their labor power. And combined this super exploitation of workers in those countries, the profits from racism accounted for about 1/3 of the total property income in the United States in 1984, again, according to Perlo. Now, as I hinted at before, the chief source of extra profits is discriminatory wage differentials. That doesn't mean paying white male workers more than the value of their labor, because white male workers, in any case, still get paid significantly less than the value of their labor, but by paying other workers even less than the white male workers are getting. Additionally, these specially oppressed groups lose income because of unemployment. Unemployment rates are higher among these groups of people. employment in occupations that do not directly contribute to profits. Here I wish we had a live audience because I'd like to draw people out about what those occupations are, but I'll give you some hints. Housekeeping in married or married couples, childcare, child rearing, all of those things within the family typically do not result in any kind of payment, and yet they're necessary for the production process. So that means that those people are denied a proportionate share of surplus value. Extra profits, though, are not the only purpose of racism and sexism. They're used to prevent the unity of the working class. And I think every day when we pick up the newspaper, when we listen to the TV or radio or go online and look at the news, we see examples of that, how racism and sexism are used to prevent the working class from acting as one in its own interests. These attacks on sections of the working class facilitate a broad anti-labor offensive by capital. So as long as the powers that be can keep us focused on the necessary fight to protect a woman's right to choose, for example, or keep us focused on red herrings about crime and personal safety in cases where there isn't any justification for that, they misdirect our attention away from who is actually conducting the exploitation of working class people. And an assault against the working class as a whole, that is successful attempts to block unionization of workers, for example, it hits with exceptional severity the specially oppressed sectors of the working class. What about unemployment? Actually, we're living in a very unusual time right now because unemployment, while it still exists and among certain groups of the population, is still very significant. It's at a fairly low level historically. But in general, as we look over a historical period, not just a snapshot of a particular moment, as the productivity of labor grows under capitalism, more goods and services are produced by fewer and fewer workers. The system just becomes highly productive. And this leads to the creation of what Marx termed the Industrial Reserve Army, which is a permanent, although varying in size and makeup, it's a permanent feature of the capitalist economy. For the capitalist, this reserve army of unemployed provides multiple benefits. It means that in times of prosperity, there's a pool of additional workers, people who have been on the unemployed rolls. Now they're available to come into the workforce and expand production, and along with that, expand profits. And then crucially, in times of recession or depression, it enables the capitalists to cut wages and recoup dwindling profits. It enables the capitalists to lay people off and to put further pressure on the working class, both through cutting back hours, cutting back wages, and forcing people to work longer and harder hours. Let's look for a moment at who the capitalist class is today. In any period, the capitalists are a class of persons possessed of wealth in money form and owning the means of production, which are set to work by hiring wage workers. That's a quote out of one of the books that I'm going to recommend to you by a British economist named Eaton. But that's a simple definition of what a capitalist, what the capitalist class is. They're people with money who own the means of production, and they use that money and they use the ownership of the means of production to, and they hire wage workers, and that's how production takes place. So the question that some people ask is, how large is the U.S. capitalist class? And in a moment, I'm going to show you some slides that that explain with a little more precision, I think. But I think at most it's around 1% of the U.S. population. And here we're talking about people who, not just who are rich, but who have enough wealth that they are able to live without having to work. And I mean, they can work if they want to, but they don't have to. They can make sufficient money from their investments, from their ownership, in order to live at a fairly decent level. And we'll look at that in a moment. And we ask the question, how is wealth distributed within the U.S. capitalist class? There is, as we will see, an extreme concentration near the top. Now, I am going to get out of my slideshow here for a moment and go to another set of slides. This is from a study that was done, or a paper that was published actually, in October of 2014 by two economists, both of whom now are at UC Berkeley. One of them, Gabriel Zuckerman, is a French economist who studied under Thomas Piketty, who people may recognize that name from the work that he published a few years back, describing the extreme concentration of wealth in the capitalist world today. But Zuckerman was at that time with the London School of Economics. So these are not fringe economists. They come from very mainstream very mainstream institutions. And I'm going to go to a chart here, which I hope you can see fairly clearly. And what this shows, I'll call your attention in particular to the blue and the red lines near the bottom of the graph. This shows the share of wealth concentrated in the top 0.1% of the population over a period of time. So if we look at the blue line, for example, and here we're looking at the top 1/100th of a percent to 1/10 of a percent. And going from about 1960, it's about 7%. And in 2014, it's up around 11%. So it goes from 7 to 11, which is a very significant increase over that period of time. Looking at the red line, we go from a little, and that is the top 1/100th of 1%. So we're talking a very small portion of the total population of rich people in the United States. It goes from about a little over 3% in 1960 to something around 11%, or an increase of almost 4 times in just that period of time from 1960 to 2014. So what we have is not only a pretty significant stratification of wealth in the United States, but an acceleration of that process of stratification. In other words, the rich get richer, and that process of the rich getting richer has accelerated in the last number of years. And I'm going to go to one more slide here. Here we are. There's a lot going on in this slide, and I don't expect people to absorb all of it. But let's look at the top section of it where it says top wealth groups. And it gives a number of families. So the full population here is 160 million families. And then it gives a number of families in each of the subgroups. And then the wealth threshold for defining, like what is the top 10%? That means you have at least $660,000. And the top 1%, at least $3,960,000. And what I'd like you to think about is how much wealth would you need in order, I mean, any of us would be happy to have $660,000. I think we feel that we were pretty well off if we had that. Maybe some people have that much who are on this call. It's not inconceivable because part of the wealth that's included here is the value of your house minus whatever is owed on the mortgage. And so if you have a house that's worth $1 million and you owe $500,000, then your wealth is $500,000. That doesn't, I think, in any way make you rich, although you're certainly better off than if you're a renter or if you're homeless. But frankly, look at the people in that top 10%. The richest of them have a wealth of $2.5 million. It's actually, as much as we would all like to have $2.5 million, you're not likely to be able to live on that without depleting the amount of your wealth over a period of time. Probably in order to have enough money to live on from the income of your investments, you have to be in that top 1% group. In other words, about 4 million up to about 14 million. And so I use that as kind of a cutting point or a dividing point between who are capitalists, in other words, people who are able to live off of income from their investment, and people who still have, to some degree or another, have to work for a living. And so I think that means that the capitalist class in the United States probably includes people in about the top 1% of wealth. Nevertheless, those aren't the richest people in the country. When we look at the top 100th of 1%, now we're talking about serious big money. We're talking about people from $100 million up to almost $400 million. And of course, and this is back in 2012, which wasn't all that long ago, it was 10 years ago. But today, look at the super fortunes of the billionaires that we know about, that we just read about in the newspapers, and they're way beyond this. So this gives you some idea of the distribution of wealth among the capitalist class and among the rest of the population. And I think, so when we talk about the slogan that was used about the 1%, the 1% really does refer to the size of the capitalist class, but it also in some ways misrepresents the level of extreme concentration of wealth, because the bulk of the wealth in this country is not concentrated in the 1%. It's concentrated in the 10th of 1% or the 100th of 1%. So with that, I'll go back to our slideshow. And so that kind of raises the question, do different sectors of the capitalist class behave differently? Well, I mean, what different sectors of the capitalist class are there? Obviously, one way of dividing them up is just in terms of sheer wealth. There's a difference between a capitalist who owns maybe 3 or 4 local grocery stores, and which may be worth some millions of dollars, $10 million maybe, and hires hundreds of workers. But their net worth is not enormous compared to Jeff Bezos or or some of the other billionaires, now hundreds and hundreds of billionaires that exist in the United States today. In addition to that, different sections of the U.S. capitalist class represent different industries and economic interests. Certainly the behavior and interests of capitalists in the retail sector, for example, are different from those in the armaments sector. There's different levels of concentration of capital. Some parts of the capitalist class are relatively small capitalists and are faced with, as a practical matter, they face quite a bit of competition. On the other hand, you have sections of the capitalist class that face almost no competition. And, you know, I mean, look at, there are, even in the very large sectors, there is competition that takes place. Even a company like Amazon has to contend with companies like Walmart, like Target, and other large, extremely large retailers that are of comparable size. Some of these don't get a lot of publicity, and others make the news more frequently because they're newer, and so they're more newsworthy, and sometimes just because their approach to public relations is different. There are also differences within the capitalist class of different historical experiences. For example, some industries have historically a high level of unionization. Until the last 2 decades, for example, the steel industry was largely unionized. Today, much less so. Today, the utility industry, I think, is probably the highest rate of unionization of any private sector industry. But you have other industries where there's, and tragically, this has become the majority, the large majority, there is practically no level of unionization. Much of the retail sector, for example, and I think, you know, all of us can probably stop and think about sectors that we're aware of where unions practically are non-existent. There's also difference from industry to industry and from region to region in the intensity of racial discrimination, the intensity of sex discrimination. Those are things that exist everywhere in capitalist society, but the intensity of them is different from place to place and from industry to industry. And then they have different relationships to foreign military and trade policies. Obviously, the armaments industry has a lot of interest in military policy and in foreign policy. There's a great deal of enthusiasm with parts of the ruling class for participation in the war in Ukraine. And part of that is simply it's an opportunity to make a lot of profit out of selling military materials. Additionally, this is something we forget about sometimes, and I'm not sure if it's the most important factor, but because of the extreme concentrations of wealth at the top, the personal preferences of individual big capitalists can affect their political behavior. And, you know, we see that going on right now with Elon Musk and his attitude towards what he considers free speech in digital media. And that's become a big news item. But even historically, there's quite a range. And I think sometimes we can get a little distracted. You know, they say you can't see the forest for the trees. And sometimes there will be individual capitalists whose behavior is not typical for their class. One fairly extreme example I can think of, in the last century, Armand Hammer was the chairman of the board, the CEO of Occidental Petroleum. And he was one of the wealthiest people in the world. And but he was also, the way he got his name, Armand Hammer, his father was a socialist and named him after the symbol of the Socialist Workers' Party. which was the main left-wing socialist party at the end of the 19th century. And their symbol was a worker's arm holding a hammer. And Hammer was, I don't know the story of how he came to own Occidental Petroleum, but he did, and he became one of the wealthiest people in the world. But he also was sympathetic in a lot of ways to socialism and became known as Lenin's favorite capitalist. He was kind of unique, though. The more typical capitalists were people like Henry Ford. Henry Ford was a ruthless. He was, on the one hand, he was a pretty brilliant organizer in his industry. He helped to develop and commercialize the assembly line, but he also was savagely anti-labor. And when attempts were made to unionize his factories, he called out his private police force, and workers were murdered in the course of those struggles. And so he was certainly in no way sympathetic. And yet, at the same time, he was, when the Soviet Union became open to some foreign trade under the Roosevelt administration, Ford was happy to find opportunities to sell technology to the new Soviet Union because he could make a profit out of it. But Ford was also a vicious anti-Semite. He spent a lot of money and a lot of his energy in popularizing anti-Jewish tropes, and was a supporter of the Nazi regime and its anti-Semitic policies. And we can go on and look at individual capitalists, and we find these peculiarities with each one of them. We find some that are more libertarian, and we find some that are more fascistically inclined. But at the bottom of it, all capitalists will do what they can in order to preserve and expand the system of capitalism, which at its core involves the exploitation of workers and the domination of the political system by the small group of capitalists that dominate the economy. Different sections of the ruling class, of the capitalist class, have, as I said, they have different approaches and opinions about foreign policy, about military policy, about trade policies. Some of the companies are dependent more upon the exploitation of workers in other countries and are interested in exporting capital and jobs to other countries where the labor costs are lower. And others may have an interest in keeping some of the production at home for various reasons. And as I said, because of these extreme concentrations of wealth at the top, these personal idiosyncrasies of individual capitalists can affect their political behavior, but in general, it doesn't change the nature of what class they represent, and whether it's a liberal capitalist or a Donald Trump or an Elon Musk. Let's talk for a minute about fascism. And sadly, we're at a moment in history when we have to be very concerned about that. And so it's worth taking a look at who the fascist-oriented capitalists are and why they're so inclined. Georgy Dimitrov, who was a Bulgarian communist who headed the Communist International in the 1930s, made the classic definition of fascism. It's the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialist elements of finance capital. Now, different sections of the capitalist class have different interests, and hence they have different agendas, as I was just going through. In general, those engaged in the extractive industries, such as oil and gas and mining, the armaments industry, and the export of capital to less developed countries, tend towards fascism. It serves their desires and needs better than liberal democracy. But for much of the capitalist class, liberal democracy, as long as it has strong protections for property rights, provides a more favorable business and social climate. That is climate not just to make better profits, but also these folks have to live in society to some extent. And frankly, a liberal democracy is a more pleasant environment than living under a fascist regime, even if you're part of the fascist class. So there is a preference in normal times for the continuation of a liberal democracy. But when push comes to shove, if their property rights, if their class domination is threatened, even these liberals tend towards fascism. So that's the end of the presentation that I'm going to make. I didn't want to include an extensive reading list. This is maybe a starting point. The third thing here, two pamphlets by Karl Marx, Wage, Labor, and Capital, and Value, Price, and Profit, are published in a single volume by international publishers. And they're sort of fundamental. The challenge with them is that the language, since they were written in the mid-1800s, the language is somewhat archaic, and the examples may be a little inaccessible to people who live today. But they're worth going back to and referring to, because this is really what defines what classical Marxism is about. John Eaton was a British economist who wrote this book, Political Economy, as a textbook for teaching workers in Britain. So it was written in English in the 1950s. The language is modern. The examples, of course, it doesn't keep up with the economy because a lot has changed since the 1950s, but it's much more, I think, readable and accessible. And I strongly recommend it. Again, it's available through international publishers. I've made a number of references to Victor Perlo here. He's written a couple of books, but this is one of them. It seems to be out of print as best as I can tell, although you can still find copies if you go online looking at used booksellers. And maybe International will reissue it if it haven't already. And then in order to understand modern capitalism in the 20th and 21st centuries, I think you have to look at Lenin's book on imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism. So that's a suggested starting reading list. And I think if you decide that this is an area that is of great interest to you, you can go on from here. And now I will hand it over to Dee to collect questions and comments from folks.
Okay, we'll open the floor again for questions and comments. Please, we have a short period of time. Mushin, your mic is open. Open your mic on your end. Yeah, there you are.
Thank you. Very quick question. What is the commodity that is sold that generates so much profit in the Wall Street? We don't know what is the commodity they're producing that the billions of dollars have been generated in income in the financial sector.
Repeat your question, Mushin, please.
Question is, what is the commodity that produces so much profit in the financial sector?
Okay, you got that, Carl.
No, that produces so much what?
So much
profit
in the financial sector. What is the commodity that produces so much profit in the Thank you, Mushin. Michael Madden, your mic is open. Michael Madden, do you want to speak?
Well, yes, thank you, Dee, and thank you, Carl, for demystifying this whole process. I just had an observation going back to your previous comments that if we were to take a breakdown of how it is that the Starbucks and particularly Google and Apple and the fellow who manufactures the cars and Amazon. In other words, right, we're on the in the middle of a successful organizing drive, part one. Imagine if it was commonly known, oh my God, the prices that we pay, you know, everyone is getting ripped off. So Carl, if the possibility that we could apply the surplus value, and this might be a study 3 months down the road, to, well, how Google is throttling the entire planet, this would be something that many people could put their hands around. And thank you once again, Carl, for this very easy to understand working class point of view on political economy. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Dee.
Thank you, Michael. And we're looking for more raised hands. Shay, your mic is open. There you are.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a comment for folks that usually get left out in this particular kind of topic. Disabled people are like legally required to be unemployed, and they can only have up to $2,000 in assets, and they're not allowed to be married. And unemployment rates for disabled people who are not on disability, for example, like autistic people, reach as high as 87%. And that's concerning too with our social policies regarding this, concerning because of COVID having somewhere in between 10 and 30% disabling rate. So I just wanted to put that out there, for people to remember, about groups that get exploited a lot. Disabled people get left out, and they bear like a massive brunt of all this.
Thank you, Shay. We have time for maybe two more. Susan, your mic is open. Susan, your mic is open. There you are.
Hi, so we have like 8 comrades here, so asking a question from someone. So what do we mean when we assert that all surplus value is created at the point of production? So how do we define the point of production?
And where are the 8 people? What state?
Minnesota.
Thank you. One more, Carl?
If there's another one, yeah, I'll take it. Is there another one?
Yes. Lo, your mic is open. Lo.
Thank you, Dee. Aloha, Carl. Thank you for this presentation. My question is, how do we bridge this gap of the knowledge that you're sharing today and the working class? I love Shaw. I've read Shaw all of my adult life, and he's often saying if workers only knew, if people only knew X, Y, or Z, there'd be a revolution in 2 weeks. I think workers instinctively know the things you're talking about, even though they may not be able to articulate as well as you are articulating what you are talking about. How do we get this knowledge base transferred from where we're speaking today to the broader working class? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Carl, you have the mic.
Okay. I'll try to answer these in order. And some of the questions, I'm not sure that I fully understood them, so I'll try to respond as best that I can based on what I understood them to be. The first question was about a commodity that produces so much profit in the financial sector. And maybe that question goes to why is the financial sector so fabulously profitable? And I think the answer in general is that the financial center, it doesn't deal with other commodities, it deals with money, and which is sort of the essential it's the commodity that defines the value or the market value of other commodities. And in that sense, it has a lot of leverage. And I think for that reason, banks and venture capitalists and anybody else who controls a lot of capital has a lot of leverage over other sections of the capitalist class. And, you know, there's no honor among thieves. And these folks are willing to rip each other off just as much as ripping off the working class. And if they have the ability to do that, if a venture capitalist can get richer by sticking it to other capitalists, they're perfectly happy to do that. And let the other capitalists do the dirty work of exploiting the workers. They'll just skim off the cream from the other capitalists. So I'm not sure if that was a question, but that's the best that I can come up with as an answer. The question about how Google is affecting the entire economy. Again, I'm not sure that I really understood that question very well. So I'm not going to try to answer it because I'll probably end up responding to the wrong thing. I do want to respond to Shay's comments about policies with respect to the disabled. I think this is a real example of some of the profound inhumanity of the capitalist system, because it illustrates the failure of capitalism in the first place to allow for the full development of the human potential of certain groups of people. And in the first place, perhaps people with disabilities. And it reflects the organization of capitalist society, in which the focus is not on developing people to their full potential. The focus is on squeezing as much labor power out of them for the least amount of money. And that's a completely inverted or perverted set of values and priorities. In a socialist society, there will be provisions for allowing every individual to develop to the full extent of their potential, and also to guarantee that because people are born or things happen to them that disable them in some way or another, and make it possible for them not to be fully competitive in the economic sphere, that they're not punished for that, and that they're allowed to live full and fulfilling lives without regard to what nature or society may have dealt out to them. The question about what is meant by all surplus value is created at the point of production. What that goes to is that I think people who are used to capitalism and sort of accept its premises think that value is created when you take some capital, take some money, and put it in a bank account. And miraculously, after a year where you had $100, now there's $104. And somehow those dollar bills conjugate and they engage in reproduction, and miraculously or through a biological process, new value is created. That isn't where new value is created. New value is created through the production process itself. And that means, and the place in the production process is not the purchase of the raw materials. It's not the purchase of the labor power. It's not the renting of the physical buildings and land and so forth that are necessary for the production. It's at the point where production actually takes place. And that is hidden from general view, but it is exactly what is going on within the capitalist economy, and that's why we focus on the point of production. It's not the only place that surplus value ends up. Obviously, it ends up in a lot of different places. And I went through that in an earlier slide where we saw some of the different hands that get placed on the surplus value that's created. But in terms of where it is produced, it happens at the point of production. And then finally, you know, the big question is, how do we carry this to the working class? If I had a real simple answer to that, somebody else would have had it a while ago and we'd have socialism already. So that's something we all have to work to discover. But what I have observed, and I think what communists generally have observed and experienced, is that working people become receptive to these ideas in the course of their struggles. I think that, for example, the workers who were trying to organize themselves at Amazon, the ones who successfully won an NLRB election in Staten Island recently, they've learned a lot. And they've learned some of these lessons that we're talking about today. In normal times and other circumstances, they wouldn't have learned those things. Sometimes it takes being involved in a struggle to open up your mind and to open yourself up to different possibilities. And it isn't only direct economic struggles. If we look at the experiences of the civil rights movement, for example, people who are involved in that, even at the leadership level, people like Martin Luther King Jr., learned a lot about how the economic system works, that things that they perhaps didn't understand going into it. And certainly that was true of a lot of the rank and file people who were involved in that movement. The peace movement is a tremendous learning arena for people. So anyway, the time has expired, I think, for this class, and I don't want to drone on beyond that time. So thank you all for your participation and attendance, and I hope that people got something out of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. I hope everyone will join us on Thursday night. We have another class on the status or well-being or lack thereof of the working class. And then we have classes on Saturday from 11 a.m. until 2:30 p.m. 2 classes on Saturday. So please join us Thursday night. Please join us on Saturday. Thank you, Carl. Good night, everyone.
Good night.